Hello and welcome back to our development of this HTML5 canvas drawing application. Now a lot of you have been asking about how we can go about saving these images to a server or to disk, and we will go over this at some point, but I thought first of all we may as well make them worth saving. So the first thing we're going to do to add a bit of variation to this application that we have is to allow the user to change the radius of the brush that we're using. So let's see how we can go about making this. So we're going to add a toolbar, as you saw in that demo, and so this is just going to be a div. Going to give this an ID of toolbar, toolbat, that would be interesting, yeah. And then within that toolbar we're going to have another div, and that's going to be ID of rad for radius. And inside there we're going to have it say radius and then a span that just has the value of the radius inside, so that's whatever that is, 10, or maybe give that an ID of rad val. And then below that some divs that will be the little plus and minus buttons that we had there. So div, I want to give it a class of rad control for radius control, and we'll copy that. Give one an ID of dec rad for decrease radius, and one an ID of inc rad for increase radius. Okay, so let's style this before we try to do anything in code. So we want to create a link with a relation style sheet, so we're just including our CSS. I'm going to call it master.css, and let's create that file, master.css. So the first thing I'm going to do is just something that I like to do is change the box sizing to border box. Now if you're not aware of what this does, there's plenty of information about it online, but basically instead of adding the border and the padding to the outside of block elements like a div, it will add it inside. So if you set a div of width, say 40 pixels, then add a 10 pixel border, it's going to add it to the inside rather than to the outside, so you don't end up with bizarre width elements. And I find that easier to work with, and you want to, if you do want to use that, also use the Mozilla prefix, because they are a bit awkward about that one. And the next thing we want to do is target our toolbar. So we want to, I'm going to make this the entire width of the window, so width 100%. Height, I'm just going to give it 50 pixels. Let's see, padding, I'll give it a 10 pixel padding. And the other thing is, if you remember in our main, we're using this e.clientx and e.clienty. These are the properties of the mouse event that we're using, and these are relative to the window. So we're drawing on the canvas but relative to the window. So this means this is only going to work if the canvas is in the same place as the actual window itself. So we can't have anything that's positioned statically that's going to push down the canvas, because then we'll have the drawing will go all bizarre. So we want to change our position on this toolbar to fixed and top to 0, and what that's basically going to do is put that on top of the canvas, so it's going to fix it to the top of the window. I'm just going to add a background color to this. I'm going to say, I think, 2F. I'm just making it up on the spot. All of this stuff you can pretty much decide what you want for yourself. It's all just down to personal taste. So as you can see at the moment this is very ugly, so what we're going to do in here, I'm going to change the text color to just white, and on the entire thing we're going to have a font family sans serif, because that's what all the cool kids are doing these days. Okay, so now we have that. In our little control boxes that we made here, we want to have a little negative in there and a little positive in there, and we can style these control boxes. So let's go in, we're using a class, so it's a dot rad control, and we can give them a width of, I'm going to give it 30 pixels because we're using border box, given this a height of 50 pixels, sorry, and a padding of 10 pixels, so we have 30 pixels of usable space within it. So if we make that height and width 30 pixels, and then background color a bit lighter than this, just so we can tell that it's a button, 4F, again, literally just making it up so it doesn't matter. And yeah, that should do. Let's have a look. Not good. You can see we're getting these new lines because divs are block elements. Block elements by default will have new lines either side of them. So what we want to say is inline block, which is the same as the block, so you still get your width and your height. It's just instead of dropping the line, it will stick on the same line. I'm also going to get those little symbols in the center, so I'm going to give that text a line of center, maybe a bit of padding at the top as well. Yeah, okay, that's nice. So now we want to hook these buttons up to our JavaScript. In fact, the buttons and the span that we set. So let's make a new JavaScript file actually. So let's say script source equals, we'll call this radius.js. Close that script tag and create that file. Nope, not a folder. Yeah, man. Radius.js. And then we want to... Okay, so in this file, make sure, by the way, that you declare it or include it after main.js because we're dealing with the radius, and our radius is defined in main.js because we're using this variable here for radius. We want to make sure that it's included afterwards, otherwise we won't be able to interact with it. So radius.js, we're going to create some variables. Let's create a min radius variable, and I'm going to set that to 0.5. A max radius variable I'm going to set to 100. A default radius I'm going to set to 20, and then we want to hook up our buttons and that little label, or that span. So we'll say span or rad span maybe equals document.get element by ID. What was it called? Rad val. Is that right? Radval. Nailed it! Okay, the others, we've got these little buttons, so decrad, or decrease radius, sorry, is hooked up to the element with ID decrad, and increased radius hooked up to element with ID incrad, and remember to put that semicolon there. By the way, if you're not familiar with this, basically this is the same as just declaring variables like this. It's just quicker, really. So you can do a comma, and this variable, this var keyword, will apply to all of them. So that's just a bit of a time saver in certain situations. So we've hooked up these buttons. Before we get the buttons to do anything, we want to create a function that will set the radius for us. So let's say var set radius equals function. Going to pass that a parameter of new radius because we want this function to set the radius equal to a given radius. So we're going to take in a radius there, and then the first thing we're going to do is make sure it's within the bounds of these two things that we've set here. So if I'm going to create an if statement, if new radius is less than min radius, then new radius equals min radius, semicolon. Else if new radius is greater than max radius, new radius equals max radius. So that's a sort of nice way to trim down into this range, in that if it's below the range, trim it to the lower bound of the range, and if it's above the range, trim it to the upper bound. So now we can be sure that new radius is within the range that we want it to be. Next thing is we just want to change the radius. So remember, we're using the radius variable from main.js for the dots that we place. So radius equals new radius. And then we also, remember, have the line width of the lines that connect the dots, and that's defined by context.lineWidth. And we want that to be twice the radius. In fact, we can just copy this line into setRadius. So to check that function is working quickly, we're going to open up the JavaScript console in our browser. If you don't know where this is in your browser, it's usually there should be some sort of develop menu, and then whatever it says console. And I think most of these interfaces are quite similar. It's usually the last icon here. So click on that, and then you'll see if we begin typing setRadius, our function will pop up. And then we can pass this a parameter. So at the moment this is I think a 10 pixel radius, and if we type in something like 40, we'll get a bigger radius. So we can see that that function that we created is working. So now we can use that function. In fact, inside this function we want to update the label. So radspan dot text equals radius. Just have a quick check that's working. So if we set radius to 5, not working. Let's use inner HTML is radius. Try that. Okay, so now we're using the inner HTML property of the radspan, which basically allows us to manipulate what's in between the two tags of the element that we've selected. And in between those two tags, we just want it to be the value that is the radius at the moment. So radspan.innerHTML equals the radius. So now we have that function, we can use it with our two buttons. So we're going to add event listeners to these buttons. So decrad.add event listener. Hopefully this sort of procedure is fairly common to you now after the last two tutorials. Now we're going to use the click event, and instead of referencing an external function, we're going to create a function within the line of event listener. So say function, open and close your parentheses because we don't need to take any parameters here. Open your curly braces and then close them before the end of the event listener. And then inside here we're just going to use our setRadius function. So setRadius to current radius minus 5. In fact, let's set a variable called interval. Yeah, and we'll use that just in case, because we're going to use this variable twice, or this value twice, because we're going to do the same thing for inc rad. So storing it in a variable makes it a bit easier. So we're doing the same thing for increase radius, this time just adding interval, and that should do the job. So if we have a look at that in Safari, you can see we have our radius going up and down, and that's affecting the radius of the brush. You can see that we're getting this weird annoying thing with the selection. So if we go into our master.css, there is a CSS property we can use for this. So if we say user select none, and because this is a really not very well standardized property, we have to use all the sort of vendor specific prefixes that you've seen before. So let's copy this out a few times. Do once for Mozilla and again for Microsoft. So this basically just means that they can't select anything in the entire document, and I think that should be okay, because I can't think of any reason why you'd need to select something in this document. So as you can see, that's got rid of our selection, so we can now interact with that without any issues. The final thing we might want to do is use our default radius. So because we've set a default radius but never used it, so we can go right at the bottom, say set radius default rad, and that will just do that on load. So there you have that. I'll close that console, and you can see we have a perfectly functioning control for changing the radius, all the way up to an upper bound of your choice and all the way down to a lower bound of your choice. You might notice that once we get down to that lower bound, if you're using a 0.5 like I am, then it goes up with the 0.5 still there. I'll leave that to you to figure out how you can change that if you want to change that. Next time we're going to make this even funkier, and we're going to add a colour palette to our application, so I hope to see you then.